Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. What I'm going to present to you today is a totally new perspective on what we call disease. It is a new understanding on the factors which cause us to be unwell. It is based on the research of Dr. Reiki Gerd Hammer. And to make his discoveries, Dr. Hammer analysed literally thousands of patients' brain scans. Patients who were suffering conditions such as cancer. But what Dr. Hammer also did was take detailed personal histories of these patients, including detailed emotional histories of the events that happened in their lives prior to the onset of their disease. His findings clearly explain what factors trigger these diseases. But more than explain what causes diseases such as cancer, Dr. Hammer's research also gives us a clear framework to work within in order to regain our health. With success rates at well over 90%, Dr. Hammer's research is definitely worth considering, and considering carefully. So tonight, or today, I introduce the German new medicine. This is a disclaimer, and I will read this clearly. This presentation and the information within it is presented to you for interest only. It is not given or intended as advice or diagnosis regarding your health. Okay, so this is the most recent picture of Dr. Hammer I could get. I got this off the internet. He is a German. He now lives in Norway and he's now retired. In 1978, Dr. Hammer was working as a head internist doctor at the Cancer Research Department in the University of Munich. So this man was working with cancer day in, day out. He was achieving the same success rates as normal medicine was achieving at that time, which is below 10%. On August 18th, 1978, he received the shocking news that his son Dirk had been shot by accident while on holiday in Italy. In Dr. Hammer's presence, Dirk lost his fight for life on December the 7th, 1978. Some months later, Dr. Hammer was diagnosed with testicular cancer. He wondered if there was a connection between the shock over Dirk's death and the onset of his cancer. So this was the starting point of the most extraordinary and enlightening journey of medical discovery, in which Dr. Hammer has discovered the true reasons why we become unwell, and ultimately, and quite paradoxically, he's discovered that there's no such thing as disease. At least disease in the context that we know it already. Taking detailed personal histories, he quickly saw a connection between the emotional life events prior to the onset of a disease and then the subsequent disease developing. As head internist doctor in a cancer research clinic, he started to commission CT scans, which is a type of scanning device which can look inside the structures of the body. So he started to commission CT scans of the brains of his patients. And what he soon discovered was that there was a discernible pattern that appeared in the brain of every patient that had a similar disease. That is to say that every patient with breast cancer would have a certain pattern in a certain place within the brain. And these findings were consistent. In fact, they were 100% consistent. So, by this point, Dr. Hammer had created a clear database of case histories and of brain scans, and that there was a clear pattern which connected these two factors. But Dr. Hammer also, being a true scientist, wanted to check that if it was a problem of the CT scanning equipment that was causing these strange patterns to appear in the brain. So he contacted the manufacturers of the CT scanners, which was a company called Siemens, and they conducted various tests, which, at the end of which, it was proved that these patterns within the brain were in fact real. Okay, so here's a picture of a brain scan. The arrow is pointing at the centre of the pattern. The pattern is quite subtle, but if you look at it carefully, you can see it's like a centre point with rings radiating out from the centre. Now, every patient that Dr. Hammer examined would have a pattern similar to this, but it would be in completely different locations within the brain. Dr. Hammer found that if patients were given appropriate advice, support and therapy, that almost all of them made a complete recovery. This includes all cancers, and his success rate was over 90%. Now we have to understand that this is over 10 times more effective than standard medicine. And Dr. Hammer was working with all cases of cancer, and most times it was advanced cancers that he was presented with. He continued to work through other doctors and privately while developing his knowledge. Dr. Hammer has been prosecuted for practicing without a license, and he's been sent to prison twice. Ironically, the success of his techniques was first discovered by the prosecuting legal team who had confiscated his records. His research is now officially named the German New Medicine, or the GNM, and the GNM offers a complete scientific system that explains the cause, the development and the natural healing processes in disease. It is based on Dr. Hammer's discovery of the 5 biological laws. So let's have a look at it. This is a website which I advise everyone who's interested to go to. It's learninggnm.com. Okay, part 2. The origin of disease is in the brain. Now, we're talking of all diseases here, and the disease might be in your foot, or your stomach, or your hand. But Dr. Hammer claims that the origin of that disease is in your brain. So this is how it progresses. Let's say something happens that shocks us to the core. It catches us off guard, on the wrong foot, so to speak, and we feel isolated over it. In that instant, the shock triggers a special biological adaption program. Now, the evolutionary purpose of this program is to help us, in a biological way, overcome the issue that we've been presented with. I appreciate that if somebody has, say, stomach cancer, we would wonder how on earth could this help us overcome anything? But to make sense of it, we have to look at the development of the cancer from an evolutionary perspective. So let's say we have this shock. So the shock hits us on 3 levels instantaneously. It hits us in the mind, and we become preoccupied with it. It hits us physically in the brain, and it forms one of the patterns which we've already seen. And it hits us in the related organ or organ structure that's related to that brain location. So we have three things happen simultaneously when a biological survival program is initiated. So there's back to the CT scan again, and it's showing a centre's point with a very subtle ring formation radiating out from it. Now, the location of this is determined by the content of the shock that we've suffered. And the location of this pattern in the brain also governs where in the body the disease, the so-called disease, is manifest. So let's look at points of view. The same shock events suffered by different people can cause totally different adaptation processes or diseases. Or in other people, it might cause nothing at all. This is because our life experience is subjective. What might be terrifying to me might be funny to my friend, and it might make the next person very angry. And we can see if we change the perspective on that picture, it changes form. And then if we look at it a bit longer, we might see another picture appears. Now, animals adapt for concrete reasons. For example, if a snake or a wolf gets a lump of bone stuck somewhere in its stomach, it will start to develop an adenocarcinoma. And the purpose of this adenocarcinoma is to create more cells which can secrete more digestive juices, which will enable this animal to pass the bone and be free of that blockage. This is happening all the time, every day, in animals as they go about their daily life. It's a survival process which helps that animal to survive. Now, human beings have evolved an advanced way of thinking, and they think figuratively or associatively. So instead of a lump of bone getting stuck in our throat or our stomach, it can be a harsh word, or the threat of bankruptcy, or the fear of loss of something in our lives. If one of these issues gets stuck somewhere in our digestive tract, it will start the same biological process. This is because our bodies look at this from an evolutionary perspective. Our body's reactions are not built on common sense, on modern knowledge. They're built on evolutionary and prehistoric reactions. Some examples of these conflicts might be a territorial loss. For example, the loss of a home, the loss of your job, the loss of your motorbike or your girlfriend, or some other prized thing that you feel very strongly connected to. Nest worries. Maybe there's a sudden shock over a child or a grandchild. Abandonment. Children often feel abandonment when they first go to school, or they get left out of the gang and they feel ostracized. These examples and many others are what trigger our innate adaptation processes. The symptoms we experience during these processes are what modern medicine calls disease. Oftentimes, the symptoms appear after the conflict has been resolved. This is when the body is trying to reverse all the adaptation processes that had been going on prior to the resolution of the conflict. We often have inflammation in the healing phase, temperature, a swelling, and so forth. So now let's look at some real examples of this body adaptation processes in action. The first one I've chosen to show you is lung cancer, and specifically alveolar lung cancer. Let's say, for example, you experience a death fright. For example, and it might be that you go to your doctor and he gives you the piece of very surprising information that the tests that he's done reveal that you have aggressive bowel cancer. Well, you weren't expecting this, and this hits you to the core. It shocks you to the very core. You feel doomed. Instantly, this shock will start a body adaptation process, and this process will affect us on 3 levels. It will affect our minds, and we will be focused on resolving this problem. It will affect our brains, and there will be a pattern appears in a very specific location in the brain which is related to your alveoli of your lungs. And it will also affect the alveoli of your lungs. The body does this because, from an evolutionary perspective, the bad diagnosis from the doctor was perceived as a death fright. And from an evolutionary perspective, a death fright is seen as being suffocated. So therefore, the body tries to adapt by creating more air processing cells within the lungs. We end up with adenocarcinoma, lung alveolar carcinoma. You get a call from the doctor's surgery, can you go in and see the doctor again? You go in and he says, we're really sorry, but your records were mixed up with somebody else and you are perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with you at all, in fact. Well, you're going to feel very relieved about this. And biologically, you're going to enter the healing phase. In that instant, the cancer will stop growing, and bacteria which have been growing in parallel with the cancer, ready for their job to remove it and decompose that cancer, will then be released by your body, under the control of your brain, to go to your lungs, and the lung cancer will then be removed naturally by these bacteria. You will experience coughing, phlegm, coughing up sputum and blood, and the symptoms of TB. Let's take example number 2, which is diabetes, and I've got in brackets for men. I put in brackets men because the conflict shock which causes diabetes in men and women is different. In men, it is a fear resistance conflict, a conflict that we experience that has the need to resist this fear. Instantly this conflict happens. It happens on 3 levels: in the mind, the pattern in the brain, and physically in the organ of the body. Well, in the case of diabetes, the pattern in the brain is as shown there at the front of the brain, sort of deep within the brain, as the brain layers fold over themselves and go into the center of the brain. When this pattern appears in the brain, the beta cells in the pancreas instantly are inhibited from working, to varying degrees depending on the severity of the shock. But what happens then is that we stop producing insulin. Medically, we're called diabetic. Evolutionary speaking, this will mean that we have more blood sugar. And from an evolutionary perspective, this will help us struggle to overcome the fear resistance conflict. The insulin control centers in the brain stops the pancreas beta cells producing insulin. We become diabetic, like we've stated. The evolutionary perspective is also as we've stated. But importantly, when we resolve the conflict, we enter the healing phase. And we will experience various imbalances in our blood sugar levels, but the end result of this will be a normalization of our blood sugars, and we will be free of diabetes. This is provided that the healing has occurred soon enough. Otherwise, if we've been diabetic for too long, the body forgets how to function properly. So even though we overcome the conflict shock, which is a fear resistance in men, okay, we can still remain diabetic because the pancreas is no longer able to produce insulin. Okay, so G&M is a complete and total shift in understanding of disease. It understands our body processes in sickness and in health, and it supports them to a positive, healthy conclusion. G&M is a new understanding, an understanding that sees the practical reasons behind the changes experienced in our bodies and minds as we undergo conditions that are commonly called disease. They happen for a reason. There is no disease, but only meaningful biological adaption processes. And that's, I suppose, is the inevitable conclusion that you have to come to once you have studied the work of Dr. Hammer. Disease isn't something that attacks us to trying to destroy us. It is a process our body is undergoing to try and help us overcome a problem. And we can make clear sense of this if we look at it from an evolutionary perspective. Okay, so here's two websites. The top website, stress-free-me.com, is my website. I am trained in kinesiology, and kinesiology is a complementary health modality which can accurately uncover the emotional causes behind our problems. Kinesiology also offers gentle but very, very powerful techniques to relieve these stresses and thus releasing our inner potential to heal and to be happy and healthy. So that's my website, stressfreeme.com, and underneath that is learninggnm.com. This is a website dedicated to the findings and research of Dr. Reiki Gerd Hammer. It is a website I can most strongly advise anybody who has any health issues to consult. It might take a few hours to wade through it all, but there's an awful lot of really top-class information in there. So, thank you very much for watching my presentation. I wish you all the best. Thank you.